Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this first section, we're going to talk about an overview of building a Node Express application and leveraging the Microsoft Graph. We're going to first focus on an introduction to Microsoft Graph and his API, and then we're going to go through and explaining what the code samples and SDKs and all the getting started stuff is going to be associated with creating a Node Express app using the Microsoft Graph. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. Now, the Microsoft Graph is your gateway to Office 365. And what I mean by that is that it is a single resource that proxies multiple Microsoft services. I'll talk more about this on the next slide. Now, it also allows for easy traversal of objects and relationships. So while there are lots of different Microsoft 365 services, such as talking to OneDrive or talking to Outlook for contacts and calendars, there's another one for tasks. One of the nice things about this is that how all of these different objects are related to each other, the Microsoft Graph has put those relationships into the graph, and it's built like a graph representation of all of these different endpoints. What's neat about that is that now I can easily traverse from one entity to another one, even if it crosses different endpoints, because the Microsoft Graph, they've merged all of these endpoints together for us. It also simplifies token acquisition, because with all these different services in Microsoft 365, we would have to obtain a separate access token for each one of them. The reason for that is because every single service when you talk to a different service that has a different endpoint, you need a separate access token for each one. Well, when the Microsoft Graph proxies all these together, we no longer need to do that because all of them have the exact same endpoint and they're all going to go to the graph. And then the graph is going to make those calls on our behalf to those other services or other endpoints that we would need to connect to. This also is going to eliminate, or the graph is also going to eliminate the need for a traditional discovery service, because like in the past, when we didn't have the graph, we had to make these calls to a discovery service to basically ask the different endpoints with Microsoft 365, where was my OneDrive endpoint or where was my Outlook endpoint, because the URLs could be different based on the user and the tenant. We no longer need to do that. Now the graph can figure out all of that information for us by if we just go to the /me endpoint or the /my organization endpoint to get information about me or my tenant. Now, one of the nice things about the Office 365 API or the Microsoft Graph API is that I mentioned that they were like a proxy to other endpoints that each one of the different services implements. Like we have different Office 365 services and APIs for Outlook or for OneDrive or OneNote or Planner, Microsoft Teams, etc. Well, the nice thing about the graph is that, again, it's a proxy to all those services. So you don't have to know how to talk to each one of those services or obtain an access token for each one. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that because it's a proxy, you may see new functionality and features show up in these downstream endpoints prior to when they get them and they show up inside of the Microsoft Graph. And that makes sense because the Microsoft Graph is a proxy and it can't expose functionality that doesn't exist downstream in one of the services that it's proxying. So you may have to wait a little bit for it to show up either in the beta endpoint or in the V1 endpoint of the Microsoft Graph. Some examples of this are webhooks when they were introduced to Outlook, and also when time zones were introduced when the time zone support was introduced for calendar items. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, one of the concepts we have with Azure AD, and it comes into play with the Microsoft Graph, but it really is an Azure AD thing, and that's called the Common Consent Framework. So what happens is that if you think about permissions and being able to gain access to some service, you really have like a triangle of things that you need. We have the permission, we have the user or the application, and you have the resource that you're trying to talk to. So the resource is the Microsoft Graph, the user and the application, and then you also have the permission. So the user needs to have the permission to the resource to be able to talk to it. Well, the first time the user goes to log in to Azure AD to obtain an access token to talk to the graph, Azure AD is going to look and see, has this user granted this application access to the Microsoft Graph? And specifically, has it granted access to with these permissions? And so the way that this works is that if the user has not gone through this process yet, then the Common Consent Framework kind of kicks in. And after they log in, you'll see a dialog that looks a little bit like what you see there on the right of the slide. What this is saying is that effectively behind the scenes, it's saying you've never granted this permission to this endpoint with this application. So do you now grant that permission? And so what this is doing here, this is called the delegated consent. What this is doing is this is me granting a specific application. So in this case here, it says the publisher's website, what's the name of the app? I'm going to grant this permission to the Microsoft Graph. Or in this case specifically, is I'm just granting it to Azure AD. So reading directory data and signing me in and reading my profile. If I was talking to, say, my files or to my mail, it would have other permissions that were listed there as well. This is like an end user consent. I also have the ability to grant admin consent. And what that means is that is me as a tenant administrator granting these permissions by this application to a resource on behalf of everybody in my organization. That's a much more widespread permission that I'm granting. And it's not always required, but it is required at some point. So it's just an option that's available to you. Now, with the graph, we do have two ways that we can authenticate, or with Azure AD, there's two ways we can authenticate, and the graph supports both of them. Now, one way you can do is Azure AD only. And what this is that this says that you're only going to be using a work or school account to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph or to Azure AD, and then use that to go talk to that access token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. The other option is you can use converged auth, which is Azure AD and or Microsoft accounts. And in this case here, what's nice about this is that depending on how I log in, I use the exact same code in the Microsoft Graph, the same endpoints, the same SDKs to get my files either in OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business. And I just use OneDrive as an example. The same is true for calendar and contacts and email inside of Outlook.com or in Exchange in Office 365. But the nice thing about this is that the data that you're going to go fetch is all dependent based on the login of the user that actually logged in. So I don't have to specify any special code or any special APIs or endpoints to get data for consumer accounts or for business accounts. Now, again, with the SharePoint framework, this doesn't really apply because we're only going to be logging into SharePoint Online using an Azure AD account and not a Microsoft account. Now, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft account and Azure AD accounts. This is something I just kind of mentioned a minute ago, where many apps will let you use either a Microsoft account and a Azure AD account, or I guess it's more of an or. The advantage here is that everything is the exact same. It's just a setting of what you support when you register the app inside of Azure AD. The Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint, single for all data, either business data or consumer data. Now let's talk about creating a Node.js web app application configured with Microsoft Authentication Library for authentication with the Azure Active Directory. So the way you're going to do this is you're going to go create a Node.js application. And in this screencast, we're going to be using the generator for Express to do this. It's a tool that you install on your machine, and it kind of stubs out a project for you. And if you're familiar with Visual Studio, this is kind of like the experience of File New Project. Now, when you do that, we can also specify the view rendering that we're going to use. And in our case, we're going to be using the handlebars templates. Once you've done that, the next step is going to be to install some additional packages. And these are going to be things for pulling settings from an environment file, date management or date formatting stuff, and then a couple other UI things like Connect Flash to be used to display things. Some other libraries that we're going to install are things to work with session management, Passport, Azure AD, Simple Auth 2, and the Graph client. Now, these things that are related to Passport and Simple Auth, these are things in Node.js that we use to create and manage our authentication with a Node Express app. We're going to use a tool called Passport. It's a very popular library in the Node.js world, and it allows you to define different strategies. And our strategy that we're going to employ is an Azure AD strategy. That's what the Passport Azure AD is. Simple Auth 2 is also going to be used for session management or state management, and we're going to use that to store access and refresh tokens inside of session state. Now, once that's done and we've created everything, we're then going to go through and build out the UI using the whole model view controller infrastructure. So in this first demo, we're going to see what an application looks like that's been created with Node.js and as an Express web app. Now, like other Microsoft Graph training modules that we have, this screencast is not going to show you every single little detail for creating the application. Instead, what we've done is we've focused on just showing you the sample that we've already built and walking through the important pieces of this. And the reason we do that is because dependent libraries and versions and IDEs and some experiences change over time. And we don't want the screencast to get outdated very quickly. And so instead, what we do is we focus on the final product. That's not going to change. What we have also done, though, is this screencast has an accompanying training module that goes along with it. And in that training module, you will find the final built solution for every single project. You will also find a detailed hands-on lab. And each of the exercises in the lab walks you through the same steps that you're going to see that resulted in what we have done by creating the demo. So we're going to use that to go through and set everything up. So let's go ahead and let's dive into this demo. In this first demo, we're going to look at an existing Node.js web application that we've already created and we've made some changes to. And we're going to see how this works by default as we're going to use this throughout the rest of our screencast. As I've talked about already previously in the screencast and in other graph training modules, we follow the model in the screencast where we're not going to run through the actual creation of the app in the demo, and that's primarily in the interest of time. Partly because that dependency versions of different packages and the UI for different components and the different IDEs can change from the time that we record the screencast, and things can get out of sync really quick. And so instead what we do is we try and focus more on the solution itself and explain kind of how the solution was built and what kinds of, and highlight specific pieces of code. What you can do if you want to see not only the final built solution from this project, and if you also want to see what a hands-on lab that walks you through creating the exact same thing that I'm showing you here in this screencast, go check out the training module that is associated with this screencast, as there is a detailed hands-on lab that walks you through all of the same steps. And in addition, it is also going to show you a final built solution that I'm showing you here inside this demo. So you've got all the code for it as well. Now, what we've done is we're using this thing called the Express generator, which is a very common tool that we can use for this. Everything is based on Node, and so we installed that using npm, and then we installed or set up the Express application and ran it, and so we're doing everything using like the handlebars templating model and rendering engine. Once we built that, once we created the project here, we then went ahead and installed a couple things. We installed things like the .NET env, which is loading values from an environment file or environment variable file. We are also have installed things like Moment for date time formatting, Connect Flash, that's used for flashing error messages in the app. Express Session is for session state. Passport Azure Auth is going to be used for authenticating and getting access tokens. simple Auth 2 is for token management. And then the Microsoft Graph Client is the JavaScript SDK for getting information from the Microsoft Graph. So we've installed a bunch of additional things here that we didn't have previously. If I come over here and I look at the app.js, some of the things that we've done here is that we've imported the session and the Flash projects here. And then after we did that, we then went in and we've also defined our app, created our app here, and notice that we don't have a secret that's been defined for our app. We then set up the Flash middleware for showing little alert messages and such. And that's pretty much everything we did. The rest of it's all just standing up an existing Node.js Express web app. Now, one of the things we did is underneath views, under the layout handlebars file, this is going to define what our entire UI looks like. So if you want to see how we rendered out the UI, everything is all defined right in here using the handlebars notation to show a couple things. Like if we know about the user, then they're logged in. If we don't know about the user, so in this case here, we know about them, we can write it out right here. Otherwise, we don't know who they are, and so we can just have like a sign-in button in a sense. Or here's our sign-in button right here, actually. So if we know that there's a user, then we can render that out. Otherwise, we just have a link over to our sign-in button. We've also got some CSS that's been defined as well, and we also have a route file that we've defined. And here our routes are going to route us to our main page of our app. So let's take a look at our app. So I'm going to say npm start just to render the app out the first time and take a look at what this does. Now this is running. Let's come over here and let's launch a browser and let's go to HTTP localhost 3000. And sure enough, we have our web application is now up and running. So the first step in this demo was pretty simple, was really just to create an app. We made some changes to it so that we could see what this did, and now we are in pretty good shape. So now the next step is going to be for setting up Azure AD Authentication and updating our application to do that. So let's jump back to the slides and let's talk a little bit about working with Azure AD. In this section, we're going to continue on with our screencast on building a Node Express app with the Microsoft Graph. But this time, we're going to focus on working with Azure AD. We're going to talk a little bit about creating an app registration using Azure AD, using the Microsoft Azure AD Admin Center. And then we're going to talk about how to configure the credentials and setting it up inside of our application. In the demo, we're going to see how to apply these new settings to our Node Express app. Now, where are we going to register our applications? This has changed a little bit over the years, but now where we would recommend that you go is to go to the Azure AD admin portal. That's at aad.portal.azure.com. Now, there's a bunch of advantages to using this. First advantage here is that you don't need to have a Azure subscription to get to the Azure AD admin portal. You can log in with either a Microsoft account or an Azure AD account. And you'll see in the demo, when we log into this, it looks like the Azure portal, except the options of all the different Azure resources that are available to us are all gone except for Azure AD. This new admin portal is also going to allow you to create and manage both V1 and V2 style Azure AD applications. So you can have access to both the V1 and the V2 authorization endpoints. You're also going to be able to leverage either ADAL or MSAL for authentication. And again, as I said in the last slide, that really is going to be dictated based on what you end up doing with using either the V1 or the V2 endpoint. But because we're dealing with a Microsoft Graph, as I said before, you really are going to want to focus on using the V2 endpoint. Now let's talk about how we register an Azure AD application using the Azure AD Admin Center or Admin Portal. Application registration starts by creating a brand new application. You're going to do that over that you see on the left-hand side by selecting, I want to create a new application. Once you create your new application, you're also probably going to want to define at the same time or in a subsequent step the redirect URI that you're going to want to specify. Now what this is this is going to be telling Azure AD when a user logs in, what URLs are you allowed to redirect them to? And so I need to whitelist the URL for my web application. When you're doing this in development, you're probably going to be pointing to a local host, but when you do it in production, you're going to want to change it to point to your well-formed URL or well-known URL. Because we're working with what are called confidential clients, which is a way for us to secure both the client ID and the secret, I'm going to need to create a secret for my app. And think of this as like the password for my application that it's going to use to log in with Azure AD. You're going to create the secret. This is going to be shown just one time. So after you create it, make sure you create a copy of it. You can always create a second one, but for security, it's only going to be shown once. And then the last step is you can optionally set API permissions. And these are permissions that my app is going to need in order to talk to whatever resource. So if I wanted to talk to the Microsoft Graph, then I could specify the permissions that we want to use. Now, this is dealing with what's called static consent, to where I'm defining the permissions up front. But the Microsoft Authentication Library and the V2 endpoint, as I've already discussed in this screencast, we have the ability to set it up for dynamic consent, which means that we can define the permissions we need at the time that we're actually running the app. Now in this demo, let's see how we took all of that information that we created with the Azure AD app, and let's go apply this to our Node.js application. So first we're going to go create the Azure AD application inside of Azure AD Admin Center, and then we're going to update the Node.js application. So let's dive into the demo. In this section, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create an Azure AD application that we can use in our Node.js application. And then I'm going to show you how to go modify the Node.js application to support authentication with Azure AD. So the first step is to go log into the Azure AD admin portal. I've done that by going to azuread.portal.azure.com. And I'm going to start by selecting new registration to go create a new app. I'm going to call this my graph tutorial. So I'm going to select accounts in any directory and personal accounts, so we can use that for any application. And then I'll select register. Now, once I've created the app, I need to come over here into my redirect URI. I need to specify what URL that we can redirect users to once they've logged in. And I'm going to specify this being the HTTP localhost 3000, because that's what the default Node Express app is going to be running on. And I'm going to point to the auth callback URL right there. So I'll go ahead and take that, and we should be in good shape. I'll save my changes. Now, the other thing we want is I want to also have it return an ID token as part of the request. So I'm going to select ID token and then also hit save. And the next thing we need to do is go create a secret. So I'm going to come over here to certificates and secrets and create a new client secret. And we'll just make this be called my 1-year secret. And now we can see the secret has been created. Now, before I do any of this stuff, before I go any further, I'm going to leave this up because my secret is only going to be shown for just a few minutes here, or it's only going to be shown this one time. If I refresh the page, it's going to go away. So I don't want to get anywhere away from this right now. So what I'm going to do is let's go back over to our Node.js application. Let's open this up and let's take a look at what we have. So here I've got this file here called .env example. So I'm going to rename this to just .env. And what I want to do is I need to go set some of the values here. So notice we have an ID for our app, the password or our secret. There's the callback URL. Here are the scopes or the permissions that we're looking for. And then all this other stuff is all just basic stuff that we don't have to worry about setting ourselves. That's all stuff that's all been defined ahead of time. So what I need to do is I need to fill this out, the app ID and the password. So let's jump back over to our app and let's copy the password. And let's put the password right here. And then let's go get the app ID. And I can do that by going back to the overview for the app and then copying it that way. And so just paste that in right here and save my changes. Now if I go back over to app.js, you'll notice here that I've added in this required .NET or .environment.config, and that's going to pull the environment variables from that .env file. Now, in order to implement the sign-in process, what you'll notice here is I'm going to create, let's see where. Now, in order to configure this to use the Azure AD authentication, a couple things we're going to need to do. First of all, I've added in two new statements here. One to show how to leverage the Passport Azure AD package, and then I'm also going to be pulling in the graph module as well, the graph package as well, to call the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK that's been provided to us. Now, a little bit farther down, you can see where I'm pulling all those settings here about the OAuth. So I'm going in and specifying simple OAuth 2, creating a client. I'm using the ID and the secret that we provided, and setting up the authentication details as well. And then a little bit farther down, I'm going to go configure Passport. So the way I'm doing that is I'm first creating a user's object, and then I'm creating a serialization for the user. So I'm going and fetching the user out, pasting him in, and then in the done callback, I'm going to return back null and the ID of the user. That's how we serialize them. And then to deserialize them, I'm just showing the ID coming out, pulling him out this way. I need to then define a callback function that's going to be called once the sign-in process has completed and obtained the access token. So on sign-in complete, this is going to call that, check to see, do we have the OID is found in the user profile or not. I'm going to do a check for that. If not, then we're going to go ahead and get out of here. But in this case here, we're going to first try and go fetch the user. Now, this is fetching the user using the Microsoft Graph. And we're going to ignore that for right now because we're going to talk more about the graph integration next time, in the next section. Here we're going through and setting up the authentication stuff or fetching the access token out. We see here the OAuth token, and I'm also going to save all that information inside of our token storage. And then finally, I'm going to set up, with Passport, I'm going to set up a strategy here. I'm going to do that by setting it all up to go use all of the stuff with the strategy. This is what's going to define the Passport.js library, and to use the Passport Azure AD library and configuring it with the app ID and the secret. Now that Passport has been loaded into the Express app, what I now need to do is I need to go through and initialize the Passport now that that's been defined. So if I scroll down a little bit farther, I now am initializing the Passport by the Passport I've already defined. So I'm initializing it this way, and I'm also initializing a session for the session state where it's going to store our tokens. Now, once that's done, if I go over into routes and I look at the auth route, this has all been set up for what happens when I do sign in. So when I redirect when someone goes to the sign in link, they're going to be using the passport.authenticate method, which is going to handle all of the authentication information, all the authentication process to redirect them over to Azure AD to go log in. And then when they come back, they're going to be sent to the callback endpoint. And that callback endpoint is what's going to go fetch some details from the URL using the strategy that has been provided. And then finally, we have a sign out method. That's just simply going to go use the request to destroy the session. That's effectively going to destroy the token cache that we have and any information that we have about the current user. Now, just one little bit here. Let me talk a little bit more about this callback method. This is where Azure is going to redirect the user after they do a successful sign-in. And with this code, what it's going to do when it calls passport.authenticate, it's causing the Passport Azure AD strategy to request an access token. Once the token is obtained, the next handler is going to be called, which is going to redirect them back to the home page with the access token in a temporary error value if there is an error there. The code is going to use this to verify the sign-in is working before we're going to move on. But before the test, we need to configure the Express app to use the new router, and that's using it by saying the routes/auth.js. So what I need to do is when you go to app, so in order to configure our application to use this new auth route, if I go back over here to app.js, I'm going to find a spot in the file where I'm importing the auth router right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using the define the auth endpoint that you see right here. I'm going to put in the /auth/auth router. And what that's going to do is that's going to configure our authentication piece route for our end users. So now let's give this a shot. So what I'm going to do is come back over here to our command prompt, and we're going to start the app by saying npm start. So once that's been started, I'm going to come over here to the browser, And let's go ahead and go to HTTP localhost 3000. So now let's click the sign in button. So when I click the sign in button, what's going to happen? Well, we're being redirected. We were redirected to sign in on our Node Express app, but this is going to redirect us over to Azure AD to go log in. So now let's go fetch our login details. So I'll fetch all of our login details and click sign in. And then I'm going to go ahead and click accept. So there we go. We're logged in, and you can see we're getting information about the current user right here. And we're seeing it inside of the sign in control as well. Now, how did it get this information? Well, again, if you go back to our code, and if we look at a file here called graph.js, what this is using the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK. And I'm exporting two methods here. I'm exporting the get user details. Actually, I'm only exporting the get user details. So what this is doing is it's going to take an access token being passed into it, and I'm going to create an instance of the graph client. Now I do that by calling this get authenticated client, which is right here. And you do that by using the graph SDK, calling .client.init, and you define an auth provider, and the second parameter of the callback for the auth provider is the access token, and that's going to give me back my graph client. And then from there, I can just use the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK, and specifically, I can grab use the Fluent API, or in this case, I can use the more .api syntax instead here to go fetch it. Then where it's being used, if I come back over here to the app.js file, where sign in, when I say sign in has been completed, there we go, sign in complete. When this method is going to be called, this is going to be called when sign in is actually completed. This is where I'm going to be pulling in and getting information about the user, and then I'm storing that information inside of the profile, like pulling their email address out, and if not email address, I'm using their UPN name, and then storing that inside of the user storage, which is just, in our case, is just a little session state where we're storing that stuff. All right. How are we storing these tokens? How are we storing everything? Well, if I scroll up here to the very top, what you see is we have this thing called the simple auth 2. And what this is doing is it's creating a new token store where you see auth 2, defining it for the client and all the authentication details. And all this stuff is being pulled from our settings. This is good for just for simplicity of this demo, but you probably don't want to do this in the real world because this is only being stored as session state. And so if you have like a multi-tenant instance or one where you're doing load balancing, you're going to be storing session state on each one of the different endpoints. You don't want that. You're going to want to put this in a more shared location, like in some sort of a shared cache that all the endpoints can talk to, or maybe a database. It's another option there. This is just a simple little just code demo showing you how this works. Now, one more thing I want to show you is how the tokens are being acquired here. So what you'll notice here is I have this method here called get access tokens, and this is being called whenever we need an access token. It's using this tokens.js file. Tokens are short-lived, right? An access token is short-lived. It's only good for about an hour after it's been issued. So this is where the refresh token is going to be useful, because what this refresh token is going to do is it's going to allow the app to request a new access token without requiring the user to sign in a second time. So to manage this, what we have is this file token.js that's going to handle all the management of this. So what it does, it checks to see first, do we have a current user? And if we do, then I'm going to get the stored token for that user. I'm going to check to see if that token has expired. And if it has expired, then I'm just going to call stored token.refresh. And that knows how to use the refresh token that has been stored in cache as well with this token to go reach out to Azure AD to go get a new access token that is no longer expired. And once I get that new token, I want to store that token. So I'm going to say, take the current user, I'm going to set their access token equal to this new token. And then I'm also going to return the token back. So this is what's storing it inside a cache. In this section, we're going to continue with our building a Node Express app with the Microsoft Graph, and we're going to continue by talking more about integrating the Microsoft Graph into our Node.js application. So we're going to look at how to authenticate with Azure AD. We covered that a little bit in the last demo, but we're going to see a little bit more about it in this demo or in this section. We're going to see what NPM packages we need to install, how to create an instance of the Graph Service Client, and then how to issue requests and process those results. The Microsoft Graph provides a JavaScript SDK, which you can use both client-side with client-side JavaScript and server-side with Node.js. And in our case, we're going to use the server-side, use it in a server-side example because we're working with Node.js. Now, when you go to install it, you probably want to use the latest version, but you can also specify a specific version. And so in this case, you see on the slide where I'm referencing a specific version of 1.6.0. That's just an option. The way you specify a specific version is by using the at with a version number on the very end. So in this case, at 1.6.0. If you exclude that, if you just say at Microsoft/Microsoft-graph-client, that will get the most current version that is available for you. Now, how do you obtain an access token using the Azure Active Directory and Passport.js? Well, what you're going to do is you're first going to obtain an access token from Azure AD by authenticating. And so you're first going to go obtain that access token. And once you've obtained the access token using Passport and fetching it from Azure AD, what you're then going to do is you're then going to initialize the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph. So you do that by saying graph.client.init, and you pass in a single method implementation for the auth provider method. In this case here, once auth provider has been called, what I'm going to do is I'm then going to call done, and done is going to pass in the access token that I've retrieved. Now, how do I get events from calling the Microsoft Graph? Well, in this case here, here's a method called getEvents. And what I'm doing is I'm first fetching a get authenticated client. That's going to give me my Microsoft Graph authenticated client. And that's something we talked about a little bit on the previous slide once I initialized the Graph client. So here, once I've done that, I have my client, then I can just use the Fluent API for the Microsoft Graph by calling, in this case here, client.api and going to the /me/events endpoint, and then specifying the properties that I want to retrieve, and then specifying the how I want things sorted, and then just saying .get. And that's going to give me back a collection of all of my events that I can then return back to the caller. So what does the experience look like? Well, when the user goes to launch the app, they're going to click to sign in. And once they go to sign in, that's going to present them with the Azure AD sign-in, because it's going to redirect them over to Azure AD. That user is then going to have to consent to the permissions that are being requested if they've not already done that for this app. So once they go through the consent process, we can then pass back to our application. It's going to retrieve the authorization code from Azure AD that was handed back to the user. It's going to use that to then go fetch a access token from Azure AD, initialize the Graph client, and then it can use that Graph client that's been initialized to go fetch information from the Microsoft Graph REST API. So as an overview on what's going on, just as a little bit more in depth, what you can see here is that we have our application on the bottom left-hand side. So when the user goes to sign in, they're redirected to Azure AD to go log in. And once they log in, they're then going to be sent back to the app where it can fetch an access token. Once the app has the access token, then server-side, it can reach out to the Microsoft Graph REST API. In our case, we're using the JavaScript SDK. And we're going to reach out to the Microsoft Graph to fetch all of our calendar items that we can then display in the browser. Now, how does this whole thing work? Once the access token is required or acquired, your application is going to continue to call the Graph API without having to go through the steps to obtain the access token again. Instead, it just caches it locally and it keeps using it. And at some point, the token is going to expire. A refresh token is used to obtain a new access token without requiring the user to sign in again. To understand why the MSAL library is important, it's necessary to understand what it's handling for you. Your code is going to follow a simple pattern to acquire a token silently, and if that fails, acquire it interactively. What I mean by that is that silently is going to try and fetch the token using a refresh token if it already has a token that may have expired. And if it doesn't work and it requires me to interactively log in, then it's going to prompt me to go log in. Your code doesn't need to manage the login pop-up screen. The interaction for obtaining the consent and it does not also need to manage the lifetime of the token. That MSAL does all that for you. The call to the common/OAuth v2 authorized endpoint is going to pop up a login screen and request a permissions consent, or the common consent framework. It's important to cache the refresh token to a request with a new access token, and the MSAL library is going to do that for you. There's no action for you as the developer to manage the refresh token. You can create a custom cache for persistence, but MSAL is going to manage all of that stuff for you. It is just important to understand, though, what the MSAL library is doing for you. Now, in this last demo, we're going to see how to extend our Node.js application to be able to show some additional data. In our example, we're going to be pulling information from the user's calendar and displaying that on the page. So let's see how to do that. In this last section of our screencast, we're going to incorporate more of the Microsoft Graph into the application. If you recall from the second section, the second demo, we did do a little bit with the graph where we fetched the user information, but now I want to show some events from the user's calendar. So what I've done here, if I go look at the graph.js file, we had this get user details previously, and we also had this getting authenticated client. What you're going to see what I've added here is just this get events. And all this does is it's getting a reference to the Microsoft Graph authenticated client, and then it's going to use the client to make a call to the events endpoint for the current user. I'm only interested in specific fields, and then I'm sorting it in a very specific way. Now, once that's done, if I come back over here to my application with all the different routes, what you'll see here is I've now defined a calendar.js route. And so what this does is it says when you go to the calendar right here at the /calendar path, which we'll see where this is loaded in just a minute, I'm validating that the user is currently authenticated. If they're not authenticated, they got to go back to the home page. But if they are authenticated, then we're in good shape. Now I'm going to go fetch the access token. So I'm going to do that by going to tokens.getAccessToken. And in the previous demo, you saw how I was getting the token, both forcing the user to log in, but then how I was also fetching the token out of the session state for the current user. And that was also checking to see if the token had expired. So assuming I got a token, got a little bit of error handling code right here, but assuming that I got the token, I'm then going to go to my graph object and call get events. And then once I get all those events, I'm then going to bind them to this events property here. All right. And then I'm simply going to say, go render out the view for calendar. Now, when I do that, if I come over here and I look at my views for calendar.hbs, I can see where I'm going to go look at all the different events that are passed in, and I'm just going to write them out to different table rows using the calendar or using the handlebars notation. To load this view, what I did is underneath app.js, if I scroll down, I'm going to find where I define all of my routes. There we go, right here, where I've defined my route. So if I go to /calendar, that's where I'm going to use the calendar router, or the calendar controller is really a better way to say it. These are actual controllers. They're not just routers that are being set up. So let's take this. I'm now going to come back over to the command prompt and let's start this project up. Now that it's running, let's go to the browser. Let's go ahead and start our app up. And now that it's started, we're going to come back over here to the browser and let's navigate to HTTP localhost 3000. So now we're going to first sign in. We got to pass in our credentials again. There we go, we're all signed in. And now we go back to the page. Now if I come over here to calendar, it should fetch, and sure enough it does. It uses the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK, which is calling the Microsoft Graph REST API to go fetch our calendar items. And it did that because it had a access token that was granted to the user that had the scope for going and reaching out and getting my calendar items from my calendar. So it's pretty straightforward. In this demo, you saw how to take your Node.js Express application that was set up to go authenticate with Azure AD and to now go fetch information using the graph, go fetch calendar items for the current user. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.